It all started with a photograph. A simple family reunion shot taken during their trip to the Queen Mary Hotel in Long Beach, California. The sprawling ocean liner, now permanently docked and converted into a hotel, exuded an old-world charm that carried whispers of its haunting past. For the Harper family, however, the trip was meant to be a celebration, a bonding experience after the recent passing of Grandma Rose. No one expected that the photograph would tear them apart. Emma Harper was the first to notice. On a chilly December evening, as the family gathered in their living room to admire the photos from their vacation, she gasped. The image showed her parents, her brother, and herself sitting on a vintage bench in the Queen Mary's grand hallway. But there, looming just behind her, was the unmistakable silhouette of her grandmother, Rose. The same gentle smile, the same pearl necklace she had been buried with. "That's impossible," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling fireplace. Her mother dismissed it at first, a trick of the light, a reflection. But Emma's trembling hands betrayed her certainty. "Mom, she's right there." The room fell silent. Each family member took turns scrutinizing the photo, their disbelief growing into unease. The resemblance was uncanny, and as the weight of what they were seeing sank in, an unspoken dread crept over them. The Queen Mary was known for its paranormal activity, but the idea of Grandma Rose appearing on their photo felt deeply personal, almost too personal. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the photograph, her grandmother's shadowy figure etched into her mind. Her once fond memories of Rose began to warp, twisted by fear. The soft lullabies Grandma used to sing now echoed like distant, haunting hums in her head. The touch of her hand, once comforting, felt like icy fingers brushing against her skin in the dark. At 3:07 a.m., Emma woke with a jolt. A faint tapping sound echoed through the walls of her bedroom. It wasn't the rhythmic hum of the heater or the occasional creak of the house settling. This was deliberate, soft, insistent. Tap, tap, tap. Gathering what courage she could muster, Emma tiptoed toward the door. As she placed her hand on the doorknob, the tapping stopped. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Then, a whisper, faint but clear, as if spoken directly into her ear. "Emma." Emma stumbled back, her hand trembling on the doorknob. The voice had been so soft, yet it carried an unmistakable familiarity. She hadn't heard her grandmother say her name in months, and now the echo of it lingered in the still air like an unwelcome memory. The tapping resumed, louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. But it wasn't coming from the door. Her eyes darted to the window, where the faint light of the moon illuminated the frosted glass. Shadows moved on the other side, twisting and stretching as if beckoning her closer. "Grandma?" Emma whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of fear. She clutched the photograph in her hand, a futile shield against the unknown, and approached the window. The tapping stopped just as she reached the glass. She exhaled shakily, her breath fogging the surface. In the haze of condensation, a message began to take form. Words etched themselves into the fog, letter by letter, as if an invisible hand was writing from the other side. "Come back." Emma staggered away, the photograph slipping from her grip. It landed face up on the floor, the image of her grandmother's shadow now appearing darker, sharper, as though it were no longer content to remain confined within the print. The corners of the photograph curled slightly, as if reacting to some unseen heat. Down the hall, a faint creak sounded. Emma whipped her head around, her heart pounding in her chest. She grabbed her phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight, and stepped cautiously into the hallway. The darkness seemed to thicken around her, swallowing the beam of light as she moved. The floorboards groaned under her weight, but it was the sound of another set of footsteps, lighter, deliberate, that froze her in place. She turned quickly, shining the light behind her. Nothing. Only the stillness of the house greeted her. "Mom? Dad?" she called out, her voice trembling. No response. She pressed forward, the weight of dread settling heavily in her chest. Her journey ended at the family's study room, the door ajar. A faint glow spilled into the hallway, flickering like the light of an old film projector, her father's antique projector. She hadn't seen it in years. Pushing the door open, Emma stepped inside. The room was empty, save for the whirring projector, casting its beam onto the far wall. A silent film flickered into life, and Emma's stomach dropped as she recognized the scene. The family photo session on the Queen Mary. But this wasn't the same as before. In the film, her grandmother moved. The shadow that had been behind Emma stepped forward, its hand outstretched, reaching toward her past self on the screen. Emma's breath hitched as she watched the silent film unfold. The shadow of her grandmother, once frozen in the stillness of the photograph, moved with eerie grace. She stepped closer to the screen, her skeletal hand reaching toward Emma's image in the photo, as though trying to bridge the gap between the living and the dead. A cold wind swept through the room, though the windows were shut tight. The hair on Emma's arm stood on end as the projector flickered violently, the light dimming and brightening in rhythmic pulses. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her legs refused to move. Suddenly, the film stopped. The screen went dark, and the room fell into a suffocating silence. Emma turned toward the projector, now silent and still. Her fingers trembled as she reached out to shut it off, but before she could, the machine roared back to life. The room was flooded with light as a new image filled the screen. It wasn't the family photo anymore. It was Emma, standing alone in the hallway of the Queen Mary. The shadows seemed to dance around her like whispers of something unseen, something alive. And then, the figure of her grandmother emerged from the darkness, stepping closer and closer to the Emma in the image. Her face, though familiar, was distorted. Her smile stretched too wide, her eyes hollow and unblinking. Emma stumbled back, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribcage. "This isn't real. This isn't real," she whispered to herself, her voice quivering. The figure on the screen stopped moving, slowly. It turned its head to face Emma, not the Emma in the film, but the one standing frozen in the room. Its mouth opened, impossibly wide, as it spoke in a raspy, broken voice. "Why did you leave me?" Emma's knees buckled, and she fell to the floor, clutching the edge of a chair for support. "Grandma?" she choked out, tears streaming down her face. She couldn't understand what was happening. The Queen Mary had always been known for its hauntings, but this was personal. This was her grandmother. The voice came again, this time louder, sharper. "Why didn't you stay?" The shadow on the screen began to move toward her, stepping out of the frame. The light from the projector seemed to spill into the room, coalescing into a dark, humanoid figure. Emma scrambled backward as the shadow loomed over her. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of salt water and decay. The voice, now disembodied, echoed all around her. "Come back. Finish what you started." The room spun, and before Emma could scream, the shadow lunged toward her. Everything went black. Emma woke up on the floor of the study, the cold wood pressing against her cheek. Her head throbbed, and for a moment, she wondered if it had all been a nightmare. But the acrid scent of salt water lingered in the air, and the photograph lay next to her, its edges burned and curling inward. The image of her grandmother was gone. She sat up slowly, trying to steady her breathing. The house was silent, but not in a comforting way. It felt oppressive, like the walls were closing in. Her phone was nowhere to be found, and the clock on the wall read 3:33 a.m. She didn't need to check. She already knew it was the same time the tapping had started. The memory of the whisper sent a chill down her spine. "Come back," it had said. But come back to what? The Queen Mary? Emma had never been one to believe in ghosts, but now, Faced with something so unexplainable, she couldn't deny the pull of its words. By morning, the decision was made. She told her family she needed to go back to Long Beach, that there was something important she left behind. Her mother protested, worried about her state of mind, but Emma insisted. She couldn't shake the feeling that if she didn't return, the shadow of her grandmother would haunt her forever. The drive to the Queen Mary was long and heavy with tension. The closer she got, the darker the sky seemed to grow, as if the ship itself cast a shadow over the city. When she finally arrived, the looming figure of the Queen Mary greeted her like an ancient sentinel. Its weathered exterior seemed alive with secrets, the portholes glinting like eyes watching her approach. Emma checked into the hotel under a tight-lipped receptionist's wary gaze. "You know about the stories, right?" the woman asked, her voice low. "Especially that room?" Emma didn't respond. She couldn't bring herself to say it out loud. Room B340, the infamous haunted room on the ship. It was the same room they had stayed in during the family reunion, the same room where the photograph had been taken. That night, Emma found herself standing in front of the heavy wooden door of B340. Her hands trembled as she turned the key, the lock clicking open with a finality that sent shivers down her spine. The air inside was stale, cold, and heavy, like stepping into a tomb. The room was just as she remembered. The worn carpet, the faded wallpaper, the single window overlooking the endless black sea. But something was different now. It felt alive, as if the walls themselves were breathing. The photograph lay on the bedside table, though she knew she hadn't brought it with her. And then the tapping began again. The tapping echoed from the far corner of the room, slow and deliberate. Emma's heart raced as she turned toward the sound. The shadows seemed to shift with every flicker of the dim lamp overhead. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as she forced herself to take a step forward. "Grandma!" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. The air felt heavier now, pressing against her chest like an invisible weight. The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of her shallow breaths. Then, the photograph on the bedside table slid to the floor, as if pushed by an unseen hand. Emma froze, her gaze locked on it. The image had changed again. This time, it showed her standing in the very room she was in now, alone, facing the same corner from which the tapping had come. "Why are you doing this?" Emma cried, tears stinging her eyes. "What do you want from me?" The room answered with a low, guttural groan, as though the ship itself had come alive. The lights flickered violently, plunging her into brief moments of suffocating darkness. When the light steadied, she saw her grandmother standing in the corner. It wasn't the warm, comforting figure she remembered. This version of Rose was a grotesque shadow of herself. Her face was pale and sunken, her eyes void of color, and her mouth stretched unnaturally wide in a grotesque smile. Her pearl necklace dangled from her bony neck, stained with what looked like rusted blood. "You left me," the figure hissed, her voice a mix of Rose's familiar tone and something far darker. "You abandoned me." Emma shook her head violently. "No, I didn't. You were gone. We all said goodbye." The figure took a step closer, her movements jerky and unnatural. "I wasn't ready." "You didn't wait." Emma backed away until her legs hit the edge of the bed. She tried to steady herself, but the ship seemed to sway beneath her feet, though it hadn't moved in decades. The walls groaned as the shadows stretched, dark tendrils snaking toward her. "I didn't mean to leave you," Emma sobbed, clutching her chest. "I didn't know. Please, I'm sorry." The room fell silent again, the oppressive stillness more terrifying than the noise. The figure stopped inches from her, tilting its head as if studying her. Then, in a voice that sent ice through Emma's veins, it whispered, "Prove it." Before Emma could respond, the room plunged into total darkness. The floor beneath her feet seemed to vanish, and she felt herself falling. The sound of rushing water filled her ears, drowning out her screams as she plummeted into the abyss. Emma's scream died in her throat as she hit icy water. The shock of the cold stole her breath, and she thrashed wildly, desperate to find something solid to hold on to. The water was dark and endless, its surface rippling with faint, ghostly glows that seemed to beckon her deeper. Somehow, she knew she wasn't in the Queen Mary anymore. This place felt otherworldly, a liminal space caught between life and death. Echoes of voices, distorted and sorrowful, filled the air around her, mingling with the sound of her own frantic breathing. She caught glimpses of shadowy figures just beneath the water, their faces blurred but watching her with an unnatural intensity. "Prove it," the voice from the room whispered again, this time surrounding her, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was her grandmother's voice, but also something else. Something darker, more ancient. "I don't know what you want," Emma cried out, her voice breaking. "Please, just tell me what I need to do." A faint light appeared in the distance, flickering like a candle in a storm. Despite the overwhelming dread that gripped her, Emma swam toward it, her limbs heavy with exhaustion. The glow grew brighter as she approached, illuminating what appeared to be an old, rotted door floating in the water. Her hands shook as she reached out, pushing it open. On the other side was the hallway from the Queen Mary, but it wasn't the same. The walls were warped and waterlogged, the floor slick with algae. Shadows danced along the corridor, and the faint sound of laughter, her grandmother's laughter, echoed in the distance. Emma stepped through, the water vanishing beneath her feet as she crossed the threshold. She was back in room B340, but it was no longer just a room. It had transformed into a twisted reflection of itself, the walls pulsing like they were alive, the air thick with decay. In the center of the room stood her grandmother, her form clearer now, though still unsettling. Her expression was no longer angry, but sorrowful. "You left me," she said softly, her voice trembling. "You forgot me." Emma's heart ached at the words. Memories of her grandmother's final days flooded back. The hospital room, the unspoken words, the way Emma had avoided visiting toward the end because it was too painful to see her fade away. "I didn't forget you," Emma whispered, her voice shaking. "I was scared. I didn't know how to say goodbye." Her grandmother's shadow flickered, her face softening. "Then don't say goodbye. Say what you couldn't before." Tears streamed down Emma's face as she fell to her knees. "I love you. I always loved you. I'm sorry I wasn't there." The room seemed to exhale, the oppressive weight lifting slightly. Her grandmother's form began to dissolve, her smile returning to the warm, familiar one Emma had known. "I love you too, Emma. Always." With that, the shadows receded, and the room returned to normal. The photograph lay on the bed, unchanged now. Emma picked it up, clutching it to her chest as she sobbed. She could feel the presence of her grandmother fading, but this time, it felt like peace instead of loss. As Emma left the Queen Mary the next morning, the sun breaking through the clouds, she glanced back at the ship one last time. The shadows on the portholes seemed to wave goodbye, but Emma only smiled. For the first time in months, the weight of regret was gone. And in her heart, she knew, some goodbyes are not the end, but the beginning of healing.